all, and thank you so much for joining us today for this International Roundtable on Indigenous Children's Voices and Rights implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child by encouraging Indigenous children's voices.
Today's event brings together children and youth from different countries, as well as experts who are working to promote Indigenous peoples' rights and children's rights for an interactive dialogue to raise awareness and speak up for Indigenous children's rights and the Global Sustainable Development Goals. Professor Mary Claire is the Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professor in the University of Cambridge, Senior Director of the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and a full professor of international law in the University of Waterloo Faculty of Environment, as well as co-director, together with advisor Wayne Garnons-Williams, of a new book on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Through the United Nations, she advises countries' law, governance, and sustainable development. She has published over 25 books and 120 papers on law, sustainability, and intergenerational justice, edits a series of books, Cambridge University Press volumes, and serves on the boards of several law journals and on the juries of several scholarships, prizes, and foundations. She is also vice chair of the Voices of Future Generations Children's Rights Initiative International Commission and laureate of the Justitia Fundamentum Regnorum Award in 2016 and the Weeramentry International Justice Award in 2020, among other distinctions. So with that, I welcome Professor Mary Claire and invite her to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Isabella and Ella for the leadership that you are showing, and to everyone, all of the leaders and citizens who are here with us, who are looking for ways to be able to help make the world a slightly better place than the way they found it. It is an honor and a pleasure to chair this roundtable with so many brilliant speakers. I understand that an elder will be joining us, but may have been delayed and may not be available online to offer the opening prayer. And so I would like to ask if Advocate Wayne Garnon-Williams, with whom I have enjoyed many years of friendship and collaboration, might instead offer a brief prayer. I will introduce him first and then hand over the chair to him with all thanks for his kindness in being willing to step in for us. I hope that the elder will be able to join us by the closing session to help us to close this roundtable. Wayne is a First Nations 60s Scoop survivor from Saskatchewan. He's licensed to practice law in Ontario and BC, and currently a research fellow at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, where he's also completing a master's in law at the same time. He served as chair of the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations Appeal Tribunal, as well as a member of the NAFTA Secretariat from 2018 to the introduction of the USMCA, with his focus on Indigenous law and international intertribal law. He's principal director of both the Indigenous Sovereign Trade Consultancy and also his law firm, Garwill Law Professional Corporation. And he's successfully led international NGOs, federal government departments, and his own law firm for many, many years, with his deep experience of Indigenous research, political history, and grassroots leadership. And I will especially underline his service to us all in the negotiations, given his role in the International Intertribal Treaty Indigenous Organization, Investment and Trade Organization. I would like to especially underline his role in helping to bring together First Nations of Canada, the United States, the Maori in New Zealand, and other Pacific nations in a new relationship that we are so excited to be able to welcome.
So, thank you, Mary Claire. Welcome, Tanse. Hello, distinguished writers and junior ambassadors and future leaders, future international environmental change makers. Thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure. And I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. Indigenous peoples generally worldwide like to acknowledge the fact that we come from this land and we go back to this land, and we're only here for a short time, relatively speaking. So the land acknowledgement for me would be, for example, I am located in Ottawa, the national capital of Canada, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence reaches back to time immemorial. And the Algonquins as the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River watershed and its boundaries, have made and continue to make a great contribution to sustainable development in various things. So, in keeping with the protocols of building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world, it's a customary practice to acknowledge the traditional territories or ancestral lands of Indigenous peoples, and that's why there's a land acknowledgement. And I just want to take that point to say that to quote something, that the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risk Report clearly indicated that concern over the natural environment and Western industrialized society's current inability to respect it is a major cause of concern for long-term prosperity, if not survival of the species. And in the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risk Report, Indigenous nations are categorized as being best suited to help nation states meet these international environmental goals. And the report states, it's really important, this is one phrase, this one sentence really captures it all. It says, quote, humanity relies on Indigenous communities to be stewards of ecosystems, protecting and preserving environmental resources. Indigenous peoples comprise less than 5% of the world's population, but protect 80% of its biodiversity. We are meeting virtually here. So I'd like to acknowledge that the Indigenous peoples are the original occupiers, the traditional stewards, and the inherent protectors of the lands and waters where each of us attends this conference today. And that's sort of the basic opening to welcome you all, and in the context of a prayer, I wear a couple of hats, and one of the hats I wear, of course, is the chair of the 60 Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada. And the 60 Scoop, basically, if you're not familiar with it, what we're all about is in the 60s and 70s and 80s, children in Canada and the United States and in Australia and in New Zealand were taken against the parents' will and put into foster homes to be placed into non-Indigenous families to wipe out the culture of Indigenous peoples. And so we're termed the lost generation. So it's, and there's another aspect to this. Before that 60 Scoop happened, there was the residential schools. And I'm sure most of you have heard a lot about the residential schools, about children being forced to attend these schools that are not really schools, but they call them residential schools. They're actually mandatory acculturation centers where they basically wipe out language, culture, identity to enforce a homogeneous non-Indigenous perspective of the world, and that happened for many a time. So, the 60 Scoop and the healing, and in my organization, we try and help children that are now adults that have gone through these terrible processes, in helping them break the cycle of abuse, learn from this, educate the world, and heal themselves. So part of the healing is a bit of a prayer for the 60 Scoop, for the residential school survivors. And I just want to say this quick little prayer, if I may. Creator, we reflect upon the deplorable legacy of the Indian residential schools in Canada. This blight that was inflicted upon Indigenous peoples for 125 years. Only at the turn of the century was the last federally operated school closed. The transition from residential schools to 60 Scoop is no less deplorable, and so we pray. We pray for the roughly 150,000 children who, over the course of the residential school's existence, were compelled to attend. For at least 5,000 of them who died while attending residential schools. For the unmarked, lost, and lonely graves for which they were interred, and also for the roughly 25,000 children who, over the course of the 60 Scoop, were forcibly removed from their families, homes, languages, and cultures. For the unknown number of Scoop children who have died in grievously or been grievously injured and live with trauma day to day. For the many thousands of children who grieved thousands of parents who grieved at the loss of their children being abducted and removed. for the hundreds of thousands of grandparents as well who suffered the same fate of losing their grandchildren, losing their continuity, their cultural connection, their language connection, and for the communities that withered and suffered for the lack of younger generations to revigorate and repopulate the generation. And for the thousands of children who were scooped that never made it out of the state-run foster homes and suffered the physical, mental, and sexual abuse and serious long-term spiritual illnesses because of the deplorable living conditions. And for the thousands of residential school survivors and 60 scoop survivors who found themselves in lonely and painful existence that fell upon dependency of addiction and chronic illness. And for the countless generations who were the children and grandchildren of former residential school students and scoop children who suffered the syndrome of multi-generational trauma. And for those who labor daily to gather and reconstitute and repair those elements of our language and culture and community and spirituality, like this gathering here today, to connect in children, youth, Indigenous children, Indigenous youth with Mother Earth, with the spirituality that is Mother Earth, with the ecosystem, with the understandings that are time-honored and traditional. So finally, Creator, we ask a blessing upon all those who in their everyday lives quietly demonstrate an attitude of reconciliation and selflessness, such as the people gathered here today for this work, and that we continue on with such great works that we can pass the torch to our next generation of thought leaders and creative environmental activists and leaders. With that, we thank you, Creator. Amen.
And I very, very much appreciate that wonderful prayer and also the pleas that you made that are so important for opening a roundtable like this one. As you know, this Online International Roundtable on Indigenous children's voices and rights engages young leaders from different nations, as well as specialists and experts working to promote Indigenous peoples and children's rights globally. In an interactive and intergenerational dialogue, we all are working together to strengthen the dialogue and the understanding that is necessary to be able to continue forward in the way that has been outlined in the prayer that helped to open this event. We seek to strengthen and promote Indigenous children's rights and the global sustainable development goals, delivering on the promises that have been made in international treaties and in all of our lives. And in that light, I would be very, very honored to introduce a video address that has been sent to us by Addie Sophie Newman-Ting. She's a Gold Award-winning Indigenous child author of Finding the Language in the Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiative, and also a junior editee of the Harmony Online Journal and a student of St. Michael's University School in Victoria, British Columbia. So she's 3 hours behind where many of you are, and 7, maybe 8 or even 9 hours coming online from where I am. On her father's side, she is Waka Wak and also Coast Salish Indigenous, as well as English, Irish, and Scottish. And on her mother's side, she is Chinese from Taiwan. Her Indigenous name is Kesu Gilako, which means leader of people. And her Chinese name is Ting Li Wen, meaning pretty flower cloud. Addie enjoys dancing, baking, jump roping, and singing. She's an avid reader, writer, and artist who loves to spend time with her puppy, Harriet. She hopes that her books will raise awareness for the world that we live in, and especially about the importance of saving Indigenous languages and cultures.
Hello, my name is Adeline Newman-Ting. On my father's side, I'm Coast Salish, Kwakwak, English, Irish, and Scottish. On my mother's side, I'm Chinese from Taiwan. My traditional name is Kesu Galakwa, and my Chinese name is Ding Liwen. I'm here to talk about the importance of Indigenous language. On my father's side, my traditional language is Kwakwala. On my mother's side, it is Mandarin. But mostly, I speak English. I think traditional language is important because it's such a big part of people's culture and identity. For me personally, none of my family members speak Kwakwala. When he was young, my umbo, grandpa, spoke Kwakwala at home until he went to residential school where Indigenous children from the ages of 5 to 18 are forced to speak English and not allowed to speak their traditional languages. Since then, a very small number of people from his community speak Kwakwala. This is the same for many Indigenous languages here in Canada. This is because of residential school. It is important for me and other Indigenous children to learn our traditional language because it helps you understand culture. It can also help you understand our relationship with land, air, and water. In some Indigenous cultures, the language has a different way of thinking about those three things. For example, in Cree culture, trees are referred to as they, them instead of this, that, and the names that Indigenous people gave to places described what land or what people did there. I go to a school that has classes in French, Mandarin, and Spanish. I've been taking Mandarin and I like it because it will make it easier to talk with my cousins. I also like learning about food, traditions, and culture because it is a part of who I am. I mention this because there are no classes in school for me to learn Kwakwala. There are over 1 billion people who speak Mandarin and only a couple hundred that speak Kwakwala. This makes it urgent for us to do everything we can to keep Kwakwala alive. If I could have it my way, I would make it so Indigenous languages were taught in schools as electives so people could choose to do them, like with many other languages such as French, Mandarin, and Spanish. I want to finish my remarks by saying that some adults need to know about how the choices they made to put children in residential schools affect me and my generation and many generations to come. These are the reasons why I think Indigenous languages are important and why I think that much more needs to be done to make sure that Indigenous languages that have been almost gone become more common. Thank you.
Warmest thanks to Addie and to her family. I will send a special thanks to Carrie Newman and also to Addie's mother and her village that is standing behind her and supporting her in the work that she is doing as Indigenous child author. I'll turn now to one of the Indigenous child ambassadors, who is a leader in her community and worldwide, Bella Morrisseau-Wiskijag. She grew up in the Saddle Lake Cree Nation, Treaty 6, and is Voices of Future Generations Indigenous Child Ambassador for the SDGs. She uses her skills as a young writer to help others understand how many First Nations families live, despite treaties being signed over 140 years ago that made promises differently. In early 2019, at 9 years old, Bella wrote a speech called Honor the Treaties for a school competition. She won silver for the 2019 Indigenous Child Author Competition through the Voices of Future Generations initiative, and Honor the Treaty is now being translated into many languages. She is traveling the world online and in person as a UNESCO Child Ambassador for the SDGs, touching the hearts of everyone she meets. In 2020, she became the youngest ever winner of the Global News Woman of Vision Canada Award, which celebrates the accomplishment of women in Alberta. So Bella, very warmest of welcomes, and please do let us know what you're thinking about right now.
Hi, I'm Bella. I live in Edmonton, Canada. Thank you all for being here. Today I'll be talking about water on reserves. Next slide, please. On some reserves in Canada, there isn't fresh drinking water. I was visiting Saddle Lake to see my family, and my cook took me and my cousin to go get some water. They get their water from a water fountain that filters it from the lake. The tap doesn't hurt your skin, but you cannot drink it. My cookum even told me that it is hard to wash your hair because the water can make your hair rough, sometimes tangled, like the chlorine after you go swimming. Calcium and magnesium are high, which causes rust, which makes it undrinkable. Water distribution piping carries a lot of rust and impurity. I think that a lot of the problem is pollution. So, as we all know, lakes and oceans flow into each other, underground or above ground. Obviously, we throw a lot of garbage into bodies of water, oceans and lakes, and even ponds and swamps. It's the same in Grand Rapids, Manitoba, where my great-grandparents live. My great-grandpa John is 83 and received the Order of Canada Award, and yet he is still hauling around fresh water because he can't drink from the tap. I mean, think about it. This old man still needs to get water from literally a fountain just so that he can drink water. The water fountain is outside and exposed to all the elements year-round. Average temperature in Grand Rapids in the winter is minus 20 degrees Celsius. At my house, I can walk to the tap and get a refreshing, clean cup of water. It is hard to think that I can do that every day while my family and other families on reserves have to haul water in a water bottle and not get water from the tap. It's disappointing how long this has been going on for. So I'm speaking for my family and other families on reserves who are still fighting to get water in 2022. Just like everyone else, they need water to live. My great-grandparents are in their 80s and they've been doing this since they were kids. My Cookum is still doing it from when she was a kid, generation after generation. Thank you for listening, and I and my grandparents and great-grandparents sincerely appreciate your support.
Thank you very much, Bella. And I think we will all remember the challenge that you've brought forward and the message that you have shared with us. We should be able to actually share it with others and explain the situation that you have just shared. So thank you very, very much. I understand that Sydney Winter is unable to join us today due to a last-minute health challenge in her family. I'd like us all to please send our very, very best of wishes to her and to her sisters and to others who are affected by this situation. And I would like to also thank her for having prepared and being willing to join us today. I'm now very pleased to introduce Afnan Dawood, who is joining us as well today from yet a different time zone. Afnan Dawood is a Palestinian girl from the Al-Maseri tribe in Al-Quds, Al-Shaskeria in West Jerusalem. She lives in Jordan as a refugee and serves as child ambassador in Jordan for the REAM program for young environmental leaders. She lost most of her family in the forced evacuation by the evacuation courses. As the eldest daughter, she is learning how to stitch Indigenous dresses, cook Indigenous food, and perform Indigenous dances to keep traditions alive and pass them to the next generation. She created and currently manages an Instagram to promote sustainable lifestyles with more than 50 active green children publishing their stories from the REAM program. Afna?
I am Afnan Dawood, and I'm 90 years old. I am Palestinian from West Al-Quds, and I am from the Masiri tribe. I am now wearing my indigenous dress. The Palestinian people are indigenous displaced people, and Al-Mahsiri is one of the oldest villages in occupied West Al-Quds or Jerusalem. My family lived there for generation after generation. My family lived there My family lived there for generation after generation. Al-Mahsiri has a beautiful forest and is famous for olive and grapes. No one ever went hungry. The village was destroyed in 1948 and people were killed or expelled. Indigenous people are those who inhabited the land before colonization. Palestinians are the original inhabitant of Palestine, and Israel was declared on stolen land by forced evacuation and group massacres of millions of us. A crime that is still ongoing. Palestinians are now refugees in other countries or refuge in concentrated camp in Palestine. Living as refuge makes life difficult. We want to learn our indigenous culture, but it is very difficult. We have to work so hard every day just to serve it. From my experience, it's not easy for people to celebrate and encourage Indigenous children view and story. We try just to fit into the new success. We stay low and avoid being building difficult to have a voice. It's worse for those children living under occupation. Children, they they get beaten and shot dead every day. Just yesterday, 15 innocent children were killed in Rafah and Gaza, in Palestine by Israel Air Force in their homes. Everyone scared. How can the killed, injured, injured or orphans, homeless children under occupation have a voice? Who cares to encourage their abuse and stories? So sad. However, for me, joining Dream program opened my eyes to new possibility, including how to face feeling unfair. We have weekly meeting in a safe space for discussion and expressing ourselves, and teaches us to be leaders, at least to our own lives, toward sustainability. Dream helped me to understand myself better as an Indigenous child and find courage and strength to make the world around me greener and safer, and relate to my land of origin and search more about my culture. I think it is important to support NGOs to help Indigenous children to find their voice like Dream program did for us. One important challenge we face we face when we try to make our voice heard international is the language barrier. It's difficult enough to find our voice in our language, and the language barrier makes to worse. This speak for example, I was it in Arabic and then used Google Translate, then asked for help to review it and help me with the pronunciation. Pron- I hope I can link with other Indigenous children from everywhere and share with them. Finally, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Not everyone cares to listen to Indigenous children, especially disabled children, and I hope I succeeded to represent Indigenous Palestinian children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Afnan. I hope you can see in the event discussion, everyone is sending you a well done and a promise that they have started to try to meet the challenges that you have placed in front of them. And we also have a special thanks that has come in for the courage to speak in a foreign language online in order to have your voice heard and bring your ideas forward. We wish we all spoke your original Indigenous language and you could speak to us first in that language. But you've done very, very well for sharing your story. And we shall also post, if anyone had trouble hearing, your speech on the website of the event so that we can read it and we can share your messages. I especially appreciate the challenge that you gave us all in terms of discovering history, discovering roots, and helping to celebrate and pass them on to future generations and work together as Indigenous children, as experts, as children everywhere to have voices heard. So thank you. I'm very happy to introduce Ms. Barbara Filion, who is our next speaker today online. Barbara is Program Officer for Culture with the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. She's served in many positions, including as Reconciliation Program Director at the Canadian Museums Association and as Director of Education in Working Assumptions, an organization in California that uses art to examine social issues. And she has over 20 years of experience in cultural heritage. She grew up in the region of La Mauricie in Quebec, Innu Nation of Mashteuiast. Barbara, would you like to take the floor?
Kwe, Tanshi, Weko, Saki, Ani. Hello, bonjour. Thank you for inviting me to be here today. I want to recognize and thank the young ambassadors for sharing their important messages with us today. It's an honor to be here to speak to you on a day and on a topic that is both professionally and personally very important to me. Tanishni Keshen, my name is Barbara, and I'm of mixed heritage, member of the Innu Nation, more specifically the community of Mashteuiachin Paikwakami, as you just mentioned, Professor Marie-Claire. And I'm also the Program Officer for Culture at the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. And I'm joining you today from the beautiful lands of the Pomo Nation, more specifically the territory of the Kashaya community, who have been the caretakers of this land for millennia. So today is the International Day of Indigenous Peoples, a day meant to raise awareness about Indigenous peoples' resilience, mobilize resources to support communities, and recognize the incredible achievements and contributions that Indigenous people have made and continue to make to the well-being of humanity and the earth. The theme of this year's International Day is the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. This year also marks the beginning of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. International decades are urgent calls to action. This decade serves to raise awareness of the importance of Indigenous languages and support their reawakening, reclamation, preservation, maintenance, and revitalization all over the world. The UN has decided to dedicate a decade for this because it has recognized the importance of language in the transmission of traditional knowledges. Each Indigenous language reflects unique worldviews that are related to the environment, spirituality, traditions, and relationships, both human and non. Elders tell us that languages come from the land. Each language contains complex knowledge systems that have been accumulated in these territories since time immemorial. It's no accident that the first language we learn is referred to as our mother tongue. Historically and still today, mothers and women have been the primary transmitters of language as they care for their children and teach them how to communicate. This includes the mechanics of language itself, but also, as importantly, the cultural symbolism and knowledge that languages contain. So that's why today I'll focus on the importance of Indigenous languages, why they should matter for everyone, and how we all have a role to play in supporting Indigenous languages to thrive. Languages are a core part of our identities. They are foundational to who we are. They shape how we see and interact with our world. They connect us to our friends and family and foster a profound sense of belonging. That's why languages are important for individual and community well-being and recognized as a fundamental human right. In the words of Richard Ijanikoshi Kistabish, an Anishinaabe language and knowledge holder from the First Nation community of Abitibiwini, our language is the heart and soul of our culture. It allows us to communicate with each other, to transmit our concepts, our vision of the world in a holistic way, while respecting the uniqueness and characteristics of our respective communities. Language unites and brings us together. As many of you may already know, languages are disappearing at an alarming rate. Some linguists estimate that 50 to 90% of the world's 7,000 languages, most of them being Indigenous, will disappear by the end of the century. Linguistic diversity matters in the same way that biodiversity is crucial to the well-being of the earth. Every language strengthens humanity's cultural web. When one strand or language disappears, the entire web weakens. Languages are tools that enable us to solve human challenges. There is no bigger challenge facing humanity today than the environmental crisis. Indigenous knowledges, and specifically languages, provide guidance as to how to live sustainably with the earth. In other words, Indigenous languages teach us how to be in a positive and respectful relationship with the land we inhabit. For example, in my father's language, Inuamun, which I did not have the opportunity to learn, we use kinship terms to refer to many things in the natural environment. For example, rocks can be referred to as elders, animals as kin, such as brother bear. When you consider the environment that sustains and nourishes us as part of your extended family, it not only changes the way you see things, but it affects how you appreciate and care for these elements. Whether you are Indigenous or not, everyone can play a part in helping to maintain and revitalize Indigenous languages. For example, you can advocate for including them as official languages. In Bolivia, for example, they've recognized all 36 Indigenous languages as official languages in their 2009 constitution. The Bolivian government now requires territories to use at least 2 languages in their everyday operations, one being Spanish and the other being the Indigenous language of the territory in question. Canada does not yet recognize Indigenous languages as official languages, but some provinces and territories have begun to officially recognize Indigenous languages. Nova Scotia, for example, has recently introduced legislation that recognizes Mi'kmaq as its first language. Another thing you can do to support Indigenous languages is to advocate to restore the original names of territories, mountains, lakes, cities, and towns. Indigenous place names contribute to the strengthening of Indigenous histories, languages, and cultures. It also teaches you about the relationship Indigenous people have with their territories. For example, in 2018, a territory that borders Manitoba and Ontario was designated as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. The name for this territory is Pimachowinaki, which means the land that gives life in Anishinaabe-Moan. You can also follow language activists on social media and support Indigenous artists who create in their languages. Another thing you can do is learn and use common words such as hello and thank you in Indigenous languages. Using words in the original language of the territory in which you live is an act of truth and reconciliation. It recognizes the original people and history of a territory and affirms their presence today and into the future. There are many more ways you can support the maintenance, preservation, and revitalization of Indigenous languages. I hope that you are curious to find out more about Indigenous languages. I wish everyone an inspirational Indigenous Peoples Day. Chinashku metinau. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Very much appreciated. And I especially appreciate the ideas for things that everyone can do to help to address the return of Indigenous languages and their being valued in the world. And I can see Bella was smiling as well. And I think also her family member who has joined us, because it's not just one girl or one child, it's the entire family and the village and the community that is behind them. And I think we all really appreciate the presentation that you have shared with us. We have a presentation that has been prepared for us, which celebrates some of the sustainable development aspects of our treaties as well. So I will thank all of our speakers who helped to open this event. And I will turn directly to Advocate Wayne Garnham-Williams, who together with Elena Cox and with us in spirit, if I don't see her online, oh, there she is, oh good, is also Eva Wu, to give their presentation in a brief keynote to share a very special project on advancing Indigenous rights through treaty innovations. Wayne, I have already introduced, and he is chair of the National 60s Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada in this context. Elena Cox is a senior researcher with the First Nations Treaties for the SDGs project at the University of Waterloo, and also an absolutely brilliant graduate student. And Eva Wu is also a senior researcher with the project and an absolutely amazing law student at McGill University. So Wayne, Elena, Eva, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome everybody, and thank you to our wonderful hosts and presenters so far. You've all done an amazing job. Seeing these students and these youth that are just so inspirational for their age just gives such hope for the future, and I really just wanted to point that out. Today we'd like to speak to you a bit about Indigenous treaties in Canada, their importance, and their connection to international law. So currently, my team and I are working on a project that aims to analyze and dissect how the Sustainable Development Goals and the Articles of UNDRIP are fostered by and intertwined with treaty implementation, primarily through the lens of Canada's modern treaties with Indigenous rights holders. The 2015 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have set a global agenda for development towards 2030, while the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People sets the standards for affirming these rights of Indigenous people internationally as the world begins to progress along the Sustainable Development Framework. Both set a precedent for how we can sustain the environment, society, and economy, especially for Indigenous rights holders right here under Canada's modern treaties. So UNDRIP was adopted in 2007, and it protects the collective and individual rights of Indigenous people. Extractive economies such as Canada, US, New Zealand, and Australia actually initially opposed UNDRIP in large part over concerns of relinquishing power to the Indigenous peoples for decisions regarding natural resources. But luckily, what was formally introduced in UNDRIP, which all four later accepted, was free, prior, and informed consent. This is integral to upholding Indigenous rights and ensuring effective participation in decision-making. So free, prior, and informed consent is very important to ensuring effective participation. And it's a prerequisite step to relocating Indigenous peoples, implementing new development projects, administering laws, and protecting Indigenous land from hazardous materials. The Declaration sets guidelines that constitute the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world, and reinforces many of the principles for sustainable development. The Sustainable Development Goals provide a common framework to facilitate cooperation and action. For all countries, developed or developing, these goals offer sufficient set of public policy priorities and time-bound targets. They are an urgent call to address the global challenges that we face, including poverty, inequality, climate change, environmental degradation, peace, and justice. There are 17 goals that build on the previous Millennium Development Goals, which are followed by 169 targets that are used to measure and track the progress of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs have set a basis for governments, organizations, and individuals to review and reflect on the actions that are needed to create a better and more sustainable future for all. The Sustainable Development Goals and the Articles of UNDRIP are important for the sustainability of the environment and for Indigenous society, economy, and rights. Many of the objectives that are set out in UNDRIP and the SDGs are already reflected in Canada's modern treaties that govern the rights and freedoms of Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Elena, for that introduction. I will be providing a brief outline in terms of what modern treaties are, as well as some of the outcomes that we have found in the research that we have performed so far. So for those who are unfamiliar, in Canada, we have a treaty system based on historic and traditional treaties, as well as modern treaties. The treaties that we look at through this project specifically are the modern treaties that have been signed post roughly 1975. These treaties specifically are agreements that have been able to bring Indigenous leaders and their lawyers to the table to negotiate with the Government of Canada and regional governments, such as those of the provinces and territories involved. These have produced 26 to date modern treaties between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, along with the governments of certain provinces, as well as the federal government of Canada. And these treaties are located primarily in northern Canada, as well as in BC. though there are treaties throughout some of the other provinces and territories as well. These treaties outline specific benefits and legal obligations that the governments must fulfill and allude to many of the Sustainable Development Goals and UNDRIP principles that are critical to upholding the sustainable development and enforcement of the rights for Indigenous peoples themselves, which makes it critical for young people as well as for everyone who are part of the rights holder categories to understand the benefits that they are allocated through these treaties themselves. And so as such, through our project, we have been analyzing each of these treaties to assess whether or not Canada has been able to foster or frustrate the Sustainable Development Goals and UNDRIP. Here I've provided two examples in terms of some of the targets and some of the SDGs that we have analyzed. For instance, with the Gwich'in Comprehensive Agreement, we have looked at it through the lens of no poverty, specifically because the SDG of no poverty, specifically 1.4, speaks to how all men, women, and particularly the poor and vulnerable should have equal rights to economic resources. The treaty itself that was negotiated between the Gwich'in as well as the governments of the Northwest Territory and Canada enables some level of economic self-sufficiency through articles such as that stipulate that the traditional Gwich'in economy should be maintained and strengthened, and that the Gwich'in should be economically self-sufficient as well. Another example that we have is through SDG 9 and the Tan Quan Chen Council Final Agreement. This speaks to how industry innovation should be fostered throughout Canada through Target 9.1, which stipulates that countries should develop quality, reliable, sustainable, and resilient infrastructure, which includes regional and transborder infrastructure that can support human well-being. Through this agreement, the governments of the Yukon, Canada, as well as the First Nations have outlined that each Yukon First Nation final agreement shall provide for specific economic measures which shall address the interests of the Yukon First Nations and strategic investments in areas such as transportation, culture, communication, agriculture, renewable resource services, energy resources, industry, and tourism. In such a light, we have identified that this agreement as well has the capacity to empower investments for the First Nations and help foster the Sustainable Development Goals and UNDRIP as well.
I'm going to talk just a little bit about IPECTA. What is IPECTA? IPECTA is the first modern international Indigenous trade agreement. And the cool thing about this, you have to contextualize this, because before this IPECTA, Indigenous peoples didn't have a voice in international law, didn't have representation, didn't have the right to say what we wanted to say and how the environment needed to be treated when nation states were creating international trade agreements for the harvesting of resources and the plundering of the lands. Indigenous people were not at the table. Well, this is the first time in history that Indigenous people have been upheld by nation states to create their own Indigenous trade agreement. And it's precedent setting because it allows for an Indigenous philosophy of how trade should be done, not just the Keynesian Adam Smith invisible hand of reaping the environment and not looking at the consequences, but instead taking a traditional perspective, an Indigenous perspective, and a global Indigenous perspective from the Maori of New Zealand, from the Indigenes of Australia, from the First Nations and Inuit and Métis of Canada, and looking at this in a way of how can we come together and protect the environment in a way that sets a new example for international trade and commerce, and reinforces traditional knowledge, reinforces the knowledge of how to respect the land, how to give back, how to take only what you need, how to respect the seventh generation principle. All of these things Indigenous people in IPECTA were leading the way in developing these concepts, these models, this philosophy, this new philosophy in international trade, which is not a new philosophy for Indigenous peoples, but it's a new philosophy for nation states around the world. And this is the opportunity to show the world how we can change the way we do business, change the way we consume by respecting the environment, by looking at taking only what you need, embracing the seventh generation principle with respect to resource development, giving back to the environment, understanding that it's a living being, understanding that it's an ecosystem, understanding that you can't just take and take and take, you've got to give and give and give as well. So that's the thing about IPECTA that is really cool. And we're really happy about the fact that when you look at IPECTA, this is going to be we're already seeing in other international trade agreements around the world, we're seeing this opportunity where what's in IPECTA, the concepts, now they're being incorporated in other international nation state to nation state trade agreements where there's an Indigenous trade chapter, there's an environmental chapter, and these things are really respecting the need to understand that we have a finite world and we have to respect the philosophy that we have to give to the next generation and continue on that giving. We can't just take. And that's what this is all about. And it's really a cool thing. So I invite you to look up IPECTA, read it through, and understand that this model is going forward in other international trade agreements, like the New Zealand United Kingdom trade agreement, like the Indo-Pacific agreement, soon to be the Canada UK agreement. There's a bunch of them that are coming down. So it's an exciting time to embrace Indigenous culture, which embraces protection for the environment. So there we go. That's it for IPECTA. Thank you.
Thank you. You are a very, very persuasive advocate and passionate advocate for these amazing innovations that are helping to ensure that Indigenous voices are heard and that Indigenous perspectives and concerns are front and center for our new treaties, including the new trade treaties that are just being drafted. And I should especially thank you because I know you were among the people who were helping to make those treaties a reality.
A real honor to speak with many voices. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. It is a pleasure to have you here and to hear about this wonderful story. I also want to thank Elena and Eva for their excellent presentation. Your university and also your nations should be very proud of you for the work that you are doing here, and I am sure that they are. I'm going to turn to our roundtable now, who have joined us online from many different corners of the world. And I will ask if Eva and Elena and Wayne and Afnan and the others who have been speaking, including Bella, and of course Barbara, can also stay online and be part of the roundtable and give their ideas as well. This roundtable is on Indigenous rights and sustainability. It's an intergenerational roundtable on advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we have young people online who are child ambassadors, who are Indigenous leaders, who are working as professors or experts or specialists in their area. This is not meant to be a whole set of new speeches, but rather a conversation. And to focus this conversation, we have 4 key questions. The first one is, on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, how can we celebrate and encourage children's views and stories? And we have heard some answers to that question already from the wonderful people who have joined us online to help us with their opening speeches. The second question also is about why are Indigenous languages so important? And how can we promote education and culture for sustainability worldwide? The third question is, how can we foster the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which promises that children's voices will be heard in decision-making that concerns them? And finally, the fourth focus question is, how can we inspire people worldwide to help advance the global sustainable development goals while engaging with and learning from all different Indigenous peoples' insights. So we are joined here today online by Master Nico Roman, who is junior editor of the Harmony Online Journal, chair of the Cambridge Schools Eco Council, and a child ambassador of the Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiative. We're also joined by Miss Portia Garnon-Williams, who is senior editor of Harmony Online Journal and is beginning her university career at the University of Toronto, although we keep trying to persuade her to come here to Cambridge eventually. We are also joined by Dr. Aruna Alexander from the United Nations Association in Canada, Quinte branch. And Aruna, we are very, very honored to have you join us today. I understand that you are the founding president of the United Nations Association in Canada's Quinte branch, and you're working with the East Central Regional Council of the United Church of Canada, leading intercultural, interfaith, and anti-racism forum. So we're very, very glad to have you here with us, with these children, with these other leaders, and also with these experts. I have a feeling that you are probably, in a way, all three of these and more in the work that you are doing, because we are all, of course, young at heart. The other person who has joined us here today is Miss Leslie Heyman, who is professor of the Loyalist College School of Business and a member of the United Nations Association in Canada, Quinte branch. And I think I should call you Professor Leslie Heyman in that case. And also Courtney DeFriend, who is Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange of the First Nations Health Authority. With us as well as part of this conversation is Miss Jayden Hunt, who is Interim Director of the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center. And I understand that Jayden is also a member of the Mohawk Six Nations and has a master's in industrial organizational psychology, as well as many years of experience in progressive leadership and community engagement with the Indigenous community in the Waterloo region at the University of Waterloo. I'm very pleased to also welcome Miss Suskakwas, and I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce that properly. She says to call her Sunshine, which is such a beautiful name. And you can see her with her big smile. She looks just like a ray of sunshine. So I will accept that invitation gratefully and introduce you Sunshine Dunstan-Moore from the Canadian Commission for UNESCO's Youth Advisory Group. And I understand as well that Sunshine has a wonderful background in this area that she will be sharing with us as a Nalakapamux and Yakima youth from Lytton, BC, Canada, where she's a community climate justice coordinator, along with Vidya, and a Generation Power intern with the Indigenous Clean Energy, as well as a member of the Stockholm Plus 50 Youth Task Force, where she's co-created and collaborated on the Stockholm Plus 50 Global Youth Policy paper. And I saw the impact of that paper in Stockholm Plus 50. It was without a doubt one of the most important documents that was shared at that conference. So I'd like to especially recognize your global leadership in that respect, Sunshine. So we are very, very pleased that we are joined by these experts and leaders and speakers online. And what I would like to do, if it's all right with all of you, is rather than having a long list of speakers, I would like to ask if it is possible for you to let me know, either by sending a chat message or by just putting your hand up, if you would like to answer one or two of the 4 questions. And I'll go through the questions one by one, and I'll take 2 or 3 answers from each person. And then I'm going to ask you if you have comments to each other's answers that you can engage with each other about, so that it's not a laundry list of speeches, but rather a conversation, even though we're coming from such different time zones and such different backgrounds. And so what I'd like to do first is remind us of the first question, which is, on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, how can we celebrate and encourage Indigenous Children's Views and Stories. And I've had it indicated to me that we have a youth ambassador online, a child ambassador online, who is already willing to take the first stab at answering that question. And that is, of course, Nico Roman. So I will just briefly say that Nico, as well as being a junior editor of the Harmony Online Journal and a scholar at Winchester College in Winchester in the UK, he's also a UN Child Ambassador for the SDGs and edits a youth blog, hosts online eco-seminar mini-series about the SDGs, and organizes Cambridge's climate strikes. His stories have been published by Luna Spark, winning first place worldwide in 2021, and his King's College School Heron team won the 2021 UK Youth Environmentalist of the Year award. He's also starred in some drama productions and won the overall 2022 School Scholarship Prize for his academic work, his work on global education, and his sustainability work. So Nico, we're very, very glad to have you here with us. I'm very honored to introduce you. Please do say a few words about your answers to the question, on the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, how can we celebrate and encourage Indigenous children's views and stories, and indeed the stories and perspectives of all children worldwide together?
First of all, thank you very much. It's brilliant to be able to join you today online in this roundtable, standing up for our present and for our future. As you know, I volunteer as a UN Child Ambassador for the SDGs with the Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiative. As part of this commitment, I edit an online blog, Nico's Natural World, with over 9,000 impressions and hundreds of followers. I've been working together with Addie, Bella, and Sydney as Indigenous child leaders, and I especially wish to congratulate Addie on the success of her first book. Her story is amazing, she is amazing, you all are, and it is a privilege to be your friend. Even as our world is suffering from frightening heat waves and wildfires, we must still speak out for our Earth and for the future generations of all species. Climate change and biodiversity loss are real, dangerous, and urgent. As children, we are trying very hard to be heard locally and globally to stop the suffering and losses from getting even worse. If we want to make a difference, we must scale up our understanding, our education, and our voices. Indigenous children, especially like our friends and leaders here today, deserve all our support, encouragement, and teamwork to work together.
Thank you very much, Nico. I've also signaled that maybe Portia Garnell-Williams, who is here online, would also be willing to say a few words on exactly these issues. I will just give a little more background as well on Portia. She's senior editor for the Harmony Youth Voices on Science, Law, and Sustainability, an online journal that aims to create a platform for youth to share their voices on issues that concern them. And she's a passionate advocate for Indigenous rights, having partnered with the charity I Love First Peoples to bring awareness to and raise funds for Indigenous children living in Northern Canada. She's working for the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization as a policy researcher this summer, focusing on very important issues. And through her academic research and her volunteerism, Portia brings to light concerns of Indigenous injustice and inequity. So Portia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and also thank you as well to the conference organizers for inviting me to this roundtable discussion. It's wonderful to see such great dialogue on Indigenous children's rights and voices today. So yeah, to answer that first question, really, what I really want to talk about today was this problem with Indigenous representation in schools, or a lack thereof. And There's a strong correlation in schools between misrepresentation and decreased academic performance. And it's common among minority groups, but especially Indigenous youth. According to an RBC Future Launch survey that surveyed Canadian Indigenous students from 2019 to 2021, the gap in high school completion rates between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians is 15 percentage points, which in Ontario, the province I reside in as I speak to you, is the difference between an A and a B minus. And so this correlation is very a common one that we see, especially among Indigenous youth. And also another study was done by the Quaglia Institute for School Voice and Aspirations, which showed that there was a strong correlation as well between a student's sense of belonging and a student's agency. So when a student doesn't feel represented in the classroom, they don't feel they can engage in class discussion the same way other students can. And it's especially true for Indigenous students as well. And so identifying this problem now, worldviews, I want to just briefly shift gears and talk about worldviews. Worldviews are basically these collection of principles, values, and attitudes about the world that guide our thoughts and our actions. And worldviews are associated with religions, nations, and cultures. And so my idea with answering this question is that in order to encourage Indigenous children's voices, we must incorporate Indigenous worldviews in the classroom. And this starts with Indigenous people reclaiming education through teaching Indigenous ways of life, land, and language in student curriculums. And doing so, teaching those Indigenous, because Indigenous worldviews are really connected to all of these different things. And doing so, we're preserving Indigenous cultural practices while also providing real representation for Indigenous students. And as we've spoken about earlier with that study by the Quaglia Institute, there is this strong correlation between a student's sense of belonging and a student's ability to engage in the classroom. And so by encouraging Indigenous worldviews, we are also encouraging Indigenous children's insights and views. And so the more representation in the classroom, the more Indigenous students get involved and the more likely they are to be leading and engaging in issues that concern them.
Thank you. Those are extremely good points, and I think well taken for everyone here. I wonder if there is anybody else from the roundtable who'd like to address this question specifically, or if a few of you are ready to speak about the second question. Maybe just put up your hand if you'd like to do this one. Okay, I've got Courtney saying she'd like to do this one, and then I'm going to move to the next question, which is incredibly important, and I'm hoping that we will be able to have our keynote speaker back to also speak about more if there's time, Barbara Filion. So Courtney, please go ahead.
Aitneta CMC ya tiachtanat thanasnet. Tanitsanal Staminas. So I'm from Staminas First Nation on Vancouver Island. Thank you very much for having me. And it's really nice to be a part of the group. I feel so honored to be surrounded by such amazing people. I won't speak for too long, but would just like to piggyback or extend off of Portia and Nico's comments. And so some of the perspectives that I have around encouraging children is really that piece around what Portia had mentioned is the sense of belonging that children and youth really need to feel in order to feel confident to share their voice. And that's based on my own experience growing up, but also what I've observed. And so I think, creating a safe space where children and youth feel validated and confident and understand a sense of who they belong to really offers a platform for them to speak up on what it is that they believe. And so if we don't create spaces that respect Indigenous ways of knowing and being, then we will never have access to the magic and the sacred perspectives of our children, because my traditional teaching is that a child's life starts 7 generations before they're even born or conceived. And so we start to honor them before they even enter the physical world. And as we start to give them a sense of who they are and show them how valued they are and welcome them into our life cycle, they start to find their own 2 feet on the territory. And so acknowledging those are some of the pieces that we talk about with the importance of the land. And when we can allow our children to be grounded on it, if not physically grounded in their home territories, then have some sense of how it is that they belong to those home territories, they start to understand and receive messages from the other side, from the next 7 generations, the generations before them, to speak. And so our children are so sacred because they are the closest to the other side. When they come onto this side of creation, they've just come from the spirit world, and they've had access to all of what is and what was and what's going to be. So when we uphold our children and have them feel really safe and held, then that's when those messages come. And so our job as adults is to really hold children in a space where they understand how deeply they belong, not only to us as their relatives. And when I say relatives, I mean all people of creation, also the land. And so I think you're so right, Nico and Portia, around ensuring that we, as adults or as those that are the holders of our children, lift them up and allow them to speak the messages that come to them from creation. Heichka.
Thank you, Courtney. And that is such an important point too. There's a word in Spanish, respaldo, which I keep looking for a word in English that works for it, and I'm still looking, but it has exactly that idea of holding up and supporting and standing behind and being there for someone. That I think you use the word hold to say the same thing. And it is exactly that friendship link and that connection and that willingness to listen and appreciate that I think underlines all of our remarks today, and then of course also the work that we do. Now, we have a further focused question, and I think there are some experts and youth and elders online who can help us to answer it. And it is in particular, why are Indigenous languages so important? And how can we promote education and culture for sustainability worldwide? I think hidden in there is a not so subtle assumption that many Indigenous cultures and understandings are based on and founded in a deep understanding of interconnectedness, a deep understanding of what on the west coast of Canada is sometimes called sawak, the interconnection between all people, and also, of course, sustainability. So I wonder if there are some of our speakers who would be willing to help us to give their views on answers to that question. I don't know if maybe Dr. Aruna Alexandra or Leslie Heyman or Sunshine Benson Moore, any of you have something you would like to add? And if there's somebody who I can't see online right now who would like to put their hand up, that's fine too.
I have an interjection, if I may.
Absolutely.
It's Wayne
and I will
Garnons-Williams
also
here.
ask Barbara if she's online, if she can be added to the mix, because she certainly had some ideas on this one in her keynote. Please go ahead, Wayne.
Thank you. My specialization, of course, I'm a lawyer and I'm an international trade lawyer, but I'm also an international trade Indigenous lawyer that focuses on Indigenous history, Indigenous law, Indigenous culture, and how that applies to international trade. And one of the things that we were working on, I was the Canadian Indigenous lead for IPECTA, the International Peoples Economic Cooperation Agreement, and we were able to discuss trade issues from an Indigenous lens with the Maori, with the Indigenes of Australia, and they came up with their own terms, and we were able to find common validity in history, in story, but using different terms. And the language is so important, so that when you see, for example, the UK New Zealand trade agreement, you'll see that there are words that are uniquely Maori that are incorporated into the text because it can't be said any other way except for that interpretation and that phraseology. And you can unpack it, but if you try to unpack it in English, for example, you won't get the breadth and substance of it. So keeping it in that language is very important. It's important for preservation of culture, preservation of language, but as well when things get rough and there's a conflict and you have to go to a judge and to explain the issue, you're at best positioned to explain from the original meaning, from the actual text. So language is so important. That's just one slice, one tranche dealing with trade, but there's a gamut of the importance of having the Indigenous language in its original form and having the youth re-embrace it and breathe life back into the languages which are slowly dying out. So investing in the youth for the language is so important.
Absolutely. And I think that was something also that came so painfully clear and right across from what Addie was saying in her video address. Courtney, I think this is also one of your questions. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate the space to be able to share. It's very exciting to hear these questions. And so in addition to what Wayne is talking about, I completely agree. And my great-grandmother went to the Cooper Island Residential School where she lost her Hul'qumi'num language. And so she used to say, I don't have an English word for that. And so when she was trying to explain things to us, it was really difficult for us to understand what it was exactly that she was talking about. So for example, the word how we say I love you is natsleach. Within that word, there's sali. And so sali means treasure. It also means spirit. So there are words that we use interchangeably because of the energy that's attached to them. And it's so important when we talk about within the legal system, language and the energy that's attached to that, because we have accountability as spiritual beings to language. And so if we don't use those words, then there isn't as much of an emphasis or leverage or an accountability that connects our spirit to that way of being. And just one last thing that I will say, because it's so passionate to me, is the language is how it's the thread of what interconnects all things. Again, so when I was talking about that language or the belonging piece for our children, when we start to talk to them in the language that they came from, that's where they start to be reminded of who it truly is that they're connected to. So for example, when we're on a traditional territory and we acknowledge the territory that we're residing on, we speak, I've been taught to speak to the animals and the plants within their traditional names. So when we see the deer on the property in the morning, we say, Aitneta smayet. And so those animals will remember, oh, these people belong to the territory too, or these people are safe. They won't harm me in a way that we've been harmed by colonizers or settlers. They don't objectify me. When we speak that language, it's us saying in a roundabout way, I'm your sibling. And if I do need to ask you for your help, I'll do it in a way of ceremony. I would never hurt a plant or an animal without doing a form of ceremony to explain to them why we need their relationship or why we need to consume them. So when we offer the language or when we talk to the land and introduce who we are, we're telling them, these are the ancestors that I came from. This is who I am. This is where I belong. And this is why I'm here. So similar to, I think, what Wayne had said, or I apologize, somebody had said earlier this morning about how we go to the land, that's where we decay, that's where we come from. When we talk to the land in our traditional language, we're showing, I remember where I come from. This is where I was told I came from. And so when we think about a tree, they have seeds that plant thousands of forests from one tree. And it's the same for us as Hwamok Mastimok, meaning Indigenous people. We come from the land, and all of our relations and all of creation has come from dirt, earth, tamach. So just that's the sense of belonging. That's the thread that connects us to all things, is our language.
Wow, what a powerful answer to that question. We also have Sunshine, who says she's willing to say a few words about this question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to give like a quick, I guess, youth look at this, because I don't know my language. I know my word. I know a few words here and there. But when someone does ask me, because I do know a few words, I'm honest. I'm like, you know what? I'm fluent, because the language is inside me. The language is in each child and each youth and each person. It's just that it's not out yet. And I think it's really taking that decolonized look on how we view language. Just because we can't speak it fully right now, that doesn't mean it won't come back. And I'm very lucky enough to be working in the working group for the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages with UNESCO, and just to be filled in a virtual room right now, hopefully a real room soon, all these brilliant like educators and leaders, and hearing different indigenous languages too be spoken just so casually is something that just makes my ears sing. I cannot express like how much it just lightens the room. And I think it really takes that sustainable look at it too, because that's really what Indigenous teaching is. It's sustainability. And I think just as a youth, it's not something I grew up with, but now just being a little bit older and seeing it start come into more rooms and being talked about more and being brought up in big political rooms like the UN and in the government, it's really cool to see. I'm so happy to be a part of it, and I'm so happy to see even more youth and children be involved. And I think it's like a really big turning, and I think it's really cool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sunshine. I can see that Dr. Aruna Alexander is also willing to say a few words on this important question.
Thank you. I just want to make just 3 or 4 brief comments on the importance of the language in this context, the Indigenous language. It would bring to us diverse symbolic understandings within Canada, and we need the symbolic understandings of the Indigenous language. Secondly, I think in the area of psychology, most of us understand that the language is crucial to identity formation. Thirdly, it assists in community cohesion and adds to the diversity of other cultural groups in each context. And lastly, using Indigenous poetry and Indigenous arts to convey meanings, to convey universal meanings where the bridge of logic seems too wide. I think that is crucial. Thank you.
Very, very true. And yes, especially the meanings that are sometimes needed, starting right from the point that Wayne was making about how sometimes we just have to actually use the word from the language that it's from, because otherwise we would lose too much. I am going to pass to our third question. Unless Bella, who is of course one of the child ambassadors as well, would like to add anything about how we celebrate, encourage Indigenous children's views and stories, and also how we can promote education and culture for sustainability worldwide with Indigenous languages. Bella, would you like to say anything more on either of those 2 points? The third question coming up might also be of interest to you. So I think, consider yourself welcome at any point to just put your hand up and we'll bring you in, all right? Okay, perfect. So our next question is, how can we foster the implementation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Wayne and Eva and also Elaine has shared with us in their presentation? It promises, these instruments, these international treaties promise that children's voices will be heard in decision-making that concerns them. And so I've already got one flag, which is that this is another one which Nico would love to say something about. And then I'm going to turn to Leslie, to Bella, to anybody else who would like to say something, including Portia, I would imagine, and also hear from you. Please go ahead, Nico.
There we go. I hope you can all hear me again. So thank you again for the amazing answers from everyone and really educating me, and I hope the audience, about these topics and subjects. So together we stand for our children's rights as reflected in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, especially Articles 24 and 29 that promise us a healthy environment and education about nature, and also Article 12 to 13 that guarantee us a voice in decisions that concern us. The CRC, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, promises us also a healthy environment, and this right means that willful destruction of natural habitats without any regard for the planet and animals, nor for all future generations, just needs to stop. I might be only a child, but I know that advancing the world's SDGs, especially SDG 13 on climate action and SDG 15 to protect life on land, makes the difference between a terrible global nightmare and the future we want. We live in a climate emergency with sea levels rising, forests burning, droughts and famines spreading. And it will get worse if we can't all work together. We also live in a biodiversity emergency, with thousands of species already lost and many more at risk of going extinct forever, unless we can all help to protect nature and when we plan our economy. We must make sure our leaders tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis with strength and unity, and learn how to protect and include everyone, especially Indigenous voices. We can't just ignore problems until everything is just too late. I am pleading for every single leader in all areas of our economy and society, including everyone listening online, to help us find new ways to stop urgent threats of climate change and biodiversity loss, and to respect the rights of all children, just as you promised in the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. I'm going to turn to Sunshine and then to Leslie, and then I'm going to see if maybe Bella wants to add anything, given her presentation about water, which was very powerful. Sunshine.
Thank you. Yeah, kind of just to follow up with what Nico has said, we are in a triple planetary crisis, and this affects children and youth the most. Just last month, I was in Lisbon, Portugal for the Ocean Health Conference with the UN, and all these grown-up speakers, I call them grown-ups because they are much older than me, talked about not hearing about the climate crisis or hearing about climate change until their 30s. And children and youth, we have grown up in this. We have known this forever. This has been our lives. And it is taking our childhoods, our youth, and are going into many adulthoods. And in the Stockholm Plus 50 Global Youth Policy paper that we've had over 300 youth contribute to, one of our recommendations and what we called on governments and member states for was meaningful youth engagement, because they are making policies that affect our futures. And we have seen and we have been very disappointed on what has been happening. And for there to be real change for us, we need to be in those rooms. We need to be heard, and we need to be making policies that will be affecting us. And it's climate change and the climate crisis is very deeply important to me. I have gone through several of them now living in BC, and I just believe that meaningful youth engagement means having children and youth in those rooms and making it a safe space for them as well, because as an Indigenous youth, being in those spaces are not the safest right now. But I know that we are needed in there, and I like to call myself a secret agent in putting myself in there and to decolonize and making sure that our voices are heard and that those spaces will be safe. So children and Indigenous children, when they are in those spaces, they don't get the feelings that I do now, which is sometimes scary. Thank you.
Absolutely, Sunshine. And speaking as someone who, when I was 17, was up on the floor of the UN, and after fighting for a treaty, was told by the business and industry rep right before I had to speak, after traveling by land from Canada to Chile and up to Brazil in order to raise awareness about these issues, was told by the industry rep, all this treaty that you've been fighting for, it's just going to gather dust on the shelves of the United Nations. The public is too stupid to understand climate change. Needless to say, I did not agree with him then. I still don't agree with him today. And exactly the work that you are doing is proving that you are so right in what you're saying about helping to make these spaces slowly, person by person, safer. We have Leslie Heyman, who is willing to say a few words next. And I can see also that Portia has her hand up, and so does Aruna. And all you do, Bella, if you're interested, is you put up your hand, and then I can call on you too, okay? So
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sunshine, one of the things that you were saying was that you were having conversations with people, adults, people over 30 who aren't understanding that whole conversation about sustainability. And that is a real challenge. So I work in the School of Business, and one of the challenges that I have, I do teach a sustainability course as a second year course, and we have to actually start at the basic language of what sustainability is and everything that goes with it, and really get away from this notion that it's about making things greener and recycling, which within the first 10 minutes of a class, I have to get that gone right away, because it's about changing how we think about how we do business. And part of the challenges is that we don't, and I don't think we have enough Indigenous students in our business programs, because they have a very, how they look at business and how they look at sustainability is very different, and is desperately needed. And we're talking about languages, and how a lot of the languages that we're using or that are being lost are the words of the land and sustainability. And we need those languages. We need to have them so that we can continue on. So we have a lot of youth right now who, are getting it, but we have a lot in that middle that don't understand it at all. And I'm hoping that you guys come very quickly into things like business, so that we can actually make good choices and good business choices. And I think that's one of the struggles that we're having right now, is that we don't understand how we can change how we can do business, and that there is a way to do it sustainably, because we don't talk about it enough. And it's something that in all of my courses I do talk about. But that was, I think, your mention of that there's a whole segment that's just not quite there yet, and is really pulling us down, and we need to get everybody there. So thank you for your comment on that, Sanjay.
It's a really, really good point that both of you are making together. Portia, over to you.
Yes, I had remembered, I believe it was Sunshine who had mentioned talking about making safe spaces for youth, specifically Indigenous youth, to actually be represented, to actually give them that space. And this, I really believe in that, especially, and I think it really starts, like we were talking more about like policy and this kind of level, but it really starts in schools, because how can Indigenous students feel that they can lead in policy if they can't really raise their hand in class? How can they feel that they can engage in issues that actually concern them if they can't participate in class discussion with their peers? And so, even just for an example, I know that we often talk about history classes and how there's this predominant Western myth of greatness, which erases the colonial wrongdoings of history and then doesn't mention the successes of Indigenous societies. And this is an example, but it even comes down to classes like science classes, oddly enough, where students are rarely taught about the importance of maybe traditional Native knowledge. And there is great value in evidence explanation approaches to the sciences, there is, but there is this lack of trust in inherited wisdom and oral record, for example, that come from traditional Indigenous knowledge. And often it's overlooked when in fact these two approaches can and should coexist. That's just an example, but really it's this idea that we have to start at the academic level with youth, so that they can feel that they can actually go to those leaders, those adults, and start a conversation there.
Absolutely, Portia, you're totally right. And can you imagine how different geography classes would be if people really recognized Indigenous territories, Indigenous names for places? I mean, we do this now in some places like Aotearoa, but it's still so much to be done. it's still so many things to be involved in. Dr. Aruna Alexander.
Thank you. So the way I work as president of our branches, policies need to have, as most of you know, a clear implementation plan. And that implementation plan needs to be monitored. So I want to move to the concrete level of how we engage Indigenous children and what this particular branch did on the issue of the environment. This is pre-COVID. We have an excellent strategic educational model in the United Nations called the Model UN. Have any of you participated in the Model UN? It's an excellent educational tool. And so what we did with a Model UN was to bring our local Mohawk Indigenous school together with the public school system and the private school system. And we had the first ever elementary and the secondary Model UNs in our community. There were separate events, of course. The elementary Model UN lasted for 3 days, the secondary for 2. And then we organized a community and community college where Professor Leslie Heyman now teaches, Model UN on the environment. And we hope to do that again. So this is a concrete way. However, the experience taught us that the Indigenous boards of education need to work closely with the public board of education. This is crucial because speaking from experience, there was an attempt at blockage of the program. However, that was transcended by some good dialogue sessions. But concretely, I wanted to promote the educational tool of the Model UN process. And we included for the first time ever in our region here, the Indigenous school. And students were handed out their completion certificates, and there was a huge celebration and all of. So that concrete use of an educational tool was highly educational and highly community oriented. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And actually, that's a perfect segue into our final question. And we're going to turn to the questions and answers online as well. If our Zoom moderators have anything they'd like to add that is coming from the Q&A, which is, of course, how can we inspire people worldwide to help advance the global sustainable development goals while engaging with and learning from Indigenous peoples' insights? And Aruna, you've answered it brilliantly. We actually had a similar model that we used on Canada's West Coast when I was growing up that we've been able to share with others around the world as time goes on. And it was called a Council of All Beings. And it was a bit like a council conversation of elders and a bit like a court case. And of course, the humans only got one seat. You can imagine what the others had to say. Which is why it turned into a court case quite quickly. But actually, it is a way of helping people to think about and learn about what it would mean to be living in a world where all species have a voice and all are deserving of respect, as Courtney was saying as well. Now I wonder if, Leslie, Aruna mentioned that you were involved in the Model UN process as well. And one question that would maybe just come from that, which either Aruna or Leslie could answer, is just, one of the challenges we have in the UN is that it's such an imperfect instrument. I mean, it's still the only place where people can come together and at least have a voice. But it's like Sanjan was saying, it's so imperfect. And one of the biggest imperfections, obviously, from the views of many Indigenous nations, is that the minute that you're coping with this sort of legacy of colonialism, it's really hard to make sure that Indigenous nation that is surrounded on all sides by another nation that might have taken quite a bit of the territory that was originally that nation's, can still have a voice and still represent their people and their language and their culture. And I'm just wondering if you found a creative solution for that. I know we have the UN Forum for Indigenous People. We do have UNDRIP. We do have ILO 169. It's not like we're totally without tools, but in a model UN, I wonder if the Mohawk Nation was able to sit up as a nation on its own. I would love to hear that it was, but I imagine it would depend a bit on the materials you had.
So this was a lengthy process, and we had the principals of the schools involved, and those principals suggested teachers who were enthusiastic about the topic and about the Model UN process. So the training session of the Indigenous students was a lengthy process. It started about 6 months before the actual Model UN event took place. And therefore, we found that the participation by the Mohawk students was excellent. They were trained by their teachers on the process. Is that what you were asking? And so they, in that sense, they were in a position to participate with private school students as well as the public school students. It took the leadership of teachers to do that.
Thank you. And thank you. That does help us to get a picture of this wonderful experience that you've had and that could be shared. I wonder if, Courtney, you have anything last that you would like to add, or if anyone else would. And then I'm going to turn to Ella and Isabel, who have been monitoring the Q&A and might also have a couple of questions they want to bring forward. I know a few of the questions have also been answered online as we go by typing, but we can bring them forward orally in the roundtable. Courtney is smiling. I think it means she wants to hear the questions from the group. So Ella and Isabel, do we have questions online that we can bring forward?
Yes, we do have a recent question by Environmental Friends. And they say, as an educator in REAM programs for young environmental leaders, I always wonder, building on what Sunshine just said, when our children are so much aware of environmental disasters, but it is not really in their hands to end that, are we not making them more sad and putting heavy loads on their shoulders? We teach them about little things they can do every day that makes life greener around them, and we teach them to be courageous and stand up and cast their voice.
And I think the second part of the question was, but is this all what we can do?
Right. Thank you.
Point. I also noticed, Ella, you shared it, but I'll just bring it forward here. Betty Jean is online, a Black grandmother from America who is enjoying hearing and learning from all of the speakers, but is also troubled. Her maternal grandmother was a member of the Cherokee tribe in the South, and her paternal great-grandmother was a member of the Seminole, who later joined with the Cree Nation. But most Black African Americans are descendants of former slaves and were stripped of their languages. And mixed race marriages were, of course, against the law. Therefore, her Native American grandparents were not allowed to speak their language or pass it on. What can we do to celebrate our traditional languages? And I noticed Mike Scallum has put some ideas and some answers in the chat as well, very, very helpfully in the Q&A. And has sent her very good wishes and love to reconnect with her heritage. And I think some of the people here among the speakers might also be able to provide her with those links to those who are part of the Cree Nation or the Cherokee Nation, who have very, very strong and powerful language that one can learn. I'm afraid I'm in a little bit the same situation as Addie, with maybe only about 200 people who speak my mother's traditional language, and we're trying to save it right now. So in the high Swiss Alps, where people told us that Switzerland had a fourth official language called Romanche, and neglected to mention that we're actually thousands of languages. Each valley has its own language. It's not one. But we're all working on these changes. Would any of the speakers here like to add their own thoughts to answer that question, or ideas for things that they think need to be done? Go ahead, Wayne.
Yes, I read that from Betty Jo Thompson, and I hearkened back to the amazing history of the combination of Black America and Native Americans, and the fact that for a while the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Creek, the Chickasaw, they all were, unfortunately, before the American Revolution, traders, but also slave traders, and owned slaves as well. And at the end of the Civil War, they basically, all of those tribes brought in their former slaves as full members of their various tribes. And unfortunately, in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, there was a series of internal tribal laws passed that basically muscled out the freedmen, what they were referred to as, which were, of course, full indigenous authorized but originally tracing their roots back to being slaves of the tribes, but being having full rights. This was recognized in the U.S. Supreme Court as being prejudicial, and there's been efforts to move this forward, but it's prejudicial. It comes from, unfortunately, bad beliefs that have crept into the U.S. Southern indigenous society, and it's a struggle that goes on, and it's a struggle that has to be exposed. It has to be talked about. It has to be brought to light to be able to have that engagement, have that conversation, to recognize the fact that the freedmen have those rights of citizenship, and that shouldn't be anything that's prejudicial and racially based that isolates them. So it's that kind of having the courage to have those discussions is the start of that. And I thank Betty Jean Thompson for raising that important issue, because the dialogue will continue for sure.
Wow, thank you. Absolutely.
On mute.
You're being offered an option.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So you will want to hit join if that's
somebody who's, I think, just getting some help to join us online. I would also like to just highlight that if you check in the chat, you will find that Sunshine has posted the Global Youth Policy paper that was co-created by 300 plus youth globally over the last 7 months. So you can certainly find that. We do have to, many of us, go on to different engagements and commitments. And
what else do I?
Making dinner for children. So what I would like to do is to thank everyone for having joined us, and especially thank our speakers, and see if there is anywhere that anyone here online who is maybe in touch with the elder who was going to originally help us close. And
I believe
if they're not, then I think what we will do is we will turn to Ella and to Isabel to help us with our closing.
Mary Claire, the elder, has been able to join us. She's here now.
Wonderful. Well, in that case, I will introduce her and thank her again for persisting until she was able to be with us and to be able to offer us especially the closing prayer. So I will just ask or recognize and welcome the elder who has joined us now. Elder Philomene Sanderson is Plains Cree from the Musqueam First Nation, Treaty 6 in Saskatchewan, Canada. She has a working fluent knowledge of Plains Cree language and has retained many of the stories and history of the community and knowledge that has been passed on to her from other elders who are no longer with us. Elder Sanderson's duty is to share her knowledge and wisdom, and our duty is to listen, learn, and respect her words. So I'm turning to Elder Sanderson, if she would please be able to share with us a closing prayer. especially to Wayne and the team who gave such an excellent presentation, and also to Barbara and our partners and colleagues from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, from the First Nations Treaties and SDGs project at the University of Waterloo, from the University of Cambridge, from the National 60s Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada. I should also especially close by thanking the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the UN Decade for Indigenous Languages, and the United Nations Association in Canada, Pinte branch, for all of your engagement and support and ideas and insights. We hope to see you in the event for World Literacy Day with many of the other child authors from around the world and child ambassadors as well. You're all very, very welcome. Your voices, your ideas, your insights would be even more welcome on the 8th of September. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you all so much again. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Hasta
Bye-bye.
luego. Until later.